Does game balance really matter? At least as much as we think? It is talked about a lot. We fuss over it so much. Whether the factions are balanced between themselves or within themselves, or whether scenarios are balanced. So is it really as important as we think? I'm Matthew from Mini Wargaming, and that's what I want to talk about with you today. And as always, please leave comments below telling me how wrong I am, or maybe on the off chance that you might agree with me as well. So game balance has been an interesting topic of many a conversation here at Mini Wargaming. So many times we find ourselves in the lunchroom debating the importance of game balance, talking about how we want it so badly, but that whenever we achieve it, we hate it so much. So what is it about game balance that can make or break a game? And where is the line between perfect over-engineered balance and absolute anarchy and chaos, which just makes you absolutely hate the game? The first thing we should really do is define balance. And that might seem like a strange thing to do because it should seem obvious, but it's actually not as obvious as you might think, because there are different types of balance in a game. First off, there is faction balance, the balance between two different factions. If we're going to use Warhammer 40k as an example, it would be whether Space Marines have a roughly the same win rate as Tyranids. So often we see this in Meta Watch, where they'll be like, here's all of the different factions in their win-loss rates. Now, technically, a perfectly balanced game would have all of those at 50%. That no matter who you're playing against, you have the same win-loss rate. But at the same time, a game of rock, paper, scissors is perfectly balanced, and rock will never win against paper and will always win against scissors. So does that make the game good? Now, of course, we can have the argument whether rock, paper, scissors is a good game, but how would you like to know that if you play Tyranids versus Space Marines, you will always lose 100% of the time, but if you play against Eldar, you will always win, and if Eldar plays against Space Marines, they will always win. Technically, every army would have a 50% win rate, and the game would be perfectly balanced, but you would probably absolutely hate it. Another thing that you could look at too would be if a game had no difference between the factions. You can look at a game like chess, even though it's not technically a miniature war game. It's not perfectly the same because obviously the position of the queen and the king are not the same, and who goes first can have a small difference between whether you can win or not at the very, very competitive levels. But for all intents and purposes, it's pretty much as balanced a game as you're going to get. And people love it. It's a great game. Absolutely awesome. If you tried to introduce that when a pawn goes to take another pawn, it only does so on a 4+, that game would lose meaning and would not be interesting. So whatever, that's another conversation about randomness, but you understand what I'm trying to say. So there's faction to faction balance. Then there's internal balance. So when you look at the meta watch of Games Workshop, the Warhammer community, and sometimes you say, yeah, look at all those percentages, but that's not my experience. What you're really looking at there is not the percentage win rate between the factions, but the percentage win rate between specific lists that those factions bring. So a good example would be when you go to a tournament and the Eldar are doing really well, but only with a particular list. And that if you brought any other Eldar, you would have placed dead last. And so your experience at home is, I see all these Eldar players always winning tournaments, and yet I don't. Now, it could be a matter of skill, but it could also just be a matter of they have the perfect list, and you're just playing with different models within the same codex. So that is different internal balance, where you have two units that perform a similar function, and the other one obviously outperforms this one, or points-wise, it just doesn't work. And so internal balance, as we will talk about soon, I think is actually more important than inter-faction balance, although they're both important to a level. Because there's nothing I hate more than knowing that there's a portion of my collection that it's hard to play with, because if I bring them, I'm most likely going to lose because they just underperform so much. But then there's also other types of balance, such as, and not limited to, scenario balance. So for example, if you're setting up a table with terrain in a scenario, is it a mirror matchup? In other words, that your terrain is symmetrical between both sides, and that the placement objectives is symmetrical as well. But technically that's not perfectly balanced, because then if you have an I go, you go game then whoever goes first might have a severe advantage or possibly disadvantage, depending on how much terrain there is on the table. But even then, if you have a perfectly symmetrical table and one person has a close combat list and the other one has a shooting list, then once again, balance is not determined necessarily by the scenario, but by the matchup. We're all over the place here with balance. Like, where is it going to be perfectly balanced? And do you even want it to be perfectly balanced? So obviously there's an argument for perfect balance. Going back to the analogy of chess, that game has been around as long as it has because it is as close to perfectly balanced as you're going to get. When somebody has a certain rank in chess, you know what that means. You know how good they are at the game. It's not that they were able to afford the best miniatures or that they were able to look at the meta and build the perfect list every single time and all of that. You knew that they had put in the time, that they played lots of games, that they studied methodology, or maybe didn't if their score is really low, and that they earned that. When you look at the top chess players, nobody really doubts if they're good at chess or if they are top chess players because they have worked hard. Maybe obviously they're naturally talented or intelligent in relation to chess, but either way, you know they've worked hard to get there and that they've beaten other people of similar levels in order to achieve that status. So that's a good argument for perfect balance, that your strategies, that your skill are what determine if you win. It also prevents a lot of stagnation in the meta, I would say, where it's just the best list wins. And it's just who can pay the most money in a pay-to-win situation, that when something new comes out, that you scramble to buy and build and paint that in order to win the next tournament. And if the game is truly well balanced and not just my example of rock, paper, scissors balance, where it's not actually fun, but where any army has a good chance of winning against any other army, then it opens up a lot of new strategic elements, where it all of a sudden comes down to learning each other's strategies rather than exactly the composition of their lists, and building that balance between what you're bringing and how you're going to use it based on the scenarios that are going to be played. That can be really interesting, and in fact is desirable in a game. But let's face it, we don't really want perfect balance in a miniature war game. And there are quite a few reasons for that. Now, there are many arguments against balance, and I want to talk about a few of those right here, and some of them that are really important in order for games to be interesting. Having imbalance in games adds flavor. It makes things interesting. What it does do is it forces players to analyze and figure out what it is that's better than other things, and to be able to have that flavor of things that are good versus things that are not. It also means that you can give yourself a handicap. If you know that you are better at the game than somebody else, strategically, you can then try to play down by bringing something that is not as good. And there's plenty of examples of games, Warhammer included, where the factions are very asymmetrical, that they are definitely not balanced to each other. It doesn't always mean that one faction is always going to win against the other, but more so that you're just not sure based off of the fact that it's Eldar versus Tyranids, that it's a 50-50 win rate, and that you know that there's certain aspects of them that are more powerful. Now, that could be an argument against it as well, but in my mind, it does make things interesting, especially if you're playing against a lot of different people, and maybe you're playing in a more narrative or campaign setting, knowing that up against certain people, you're going to be lucky to get a win, and against others, you're going to have a better time at getting a win. That can actually create interesting situations. And also knowing that you are in more control over what is good versus the fact that the game is just so balanced that it really doesn't matter what you bring or how you compose your armies. That is also interesting. And I would also argue that especially when you're playing narratively, not competitively, that you need asymmetry in order for it to be fun. And by that I mean the best stories are not of two armies showing up to the battlefield both perfectly equipped to fight each other, but underdog stories, where one side normally wouldn't have a chance, but by the luck of the dice and by some really good strategic choices, they are able to win regardless. That by knowing that the game is imbalanced, that your victory means that much more, creates so much more of an interesting story than, well, let's just roll the dice and the dice will decide who wins. which of course I realize is an argument against it because I just said that, you know, you're the underdog and so you're hoping the dice will get you the victory. But it's a combination of that. It's a combination of the dice and a combination of the choices that you're making. So it's not perfect. Ironically, it's not perfect. That's what I'm arguing for, is that you actually don't want perfect balance so that you have these flavorful moments that happen. To me, as much as there are certain people who enjoy the challenge of a tournament and competitive play, there are many people like that, and you know, power to them. You can kind of change the game into a numbers game and try to figure out the best way to min-max your way through that, and that's fine. When you play the majority of your casual or pickup or narrative games, you don't necessarily want that. You want there to be asymmetry. You want there to be asymmetry in the setup of the terrain, and the setup of the mission, the setup of the objectives, and in the armies. Now, of course, too much asymmetry, where it's just like 10 to 1 odds or 100 to 1 odds, that isn't fun. But like 1.2 to 1 odds or 1.3 to 1 odds, that can be interesting. Now, this is the challenge for rules designers, to find the balance between symmetry and asymmetry, to figure out what it is that's going to make their game fun. And I'll address that in another video. I want to make a video that's just what makes wargaming fun and what rules make games fun and what rules make them less fun. But I would argue that imbalance is one of those things that make it fun, to a point. So finding that line, if you go towards perfect balance, it's not fun. And if you go towards perfect imbalance, it's also not fun. There is somewhere in here that you will find the right answer. And this is going to be different for each person. Some people are going to be on this side of the slider, where they're more towards perfect balance, and others are going to be more on this side, where they like the anarchy of not knowing what's going to happen, because then they don't have to get good at the game. And I'm not making fun of them. It's just something they don't get to play very often. So when they play, they'd rather the dice decide what's going to happen. And they'd rather just kind of be chaos and just tell a story and laugh and yell and whatever you're going to do as you're playing the game. And of course, the best of both worlds would be to have a game that has good and bad balance. And this can often come down to scenarios instead of factions, or maybe internal balance is part of it as well. That if you have a lot of variety within a faction, but you make sure that like 50 or 60 or 70% of it is viable, and then you have the rest of it which is maybe over or underpowered, and that way you have your place for your competitive, but then you can also have your place for narrative. So by having your internal balance not be quite balanced, that can be good. And then your scenarios can add on that. I think the one balance that I would always argue that you should strive to achieve as a rules designer is inter-faction balance, or intra-faction, whatever. Faction versus faction balance. That you want it to be that if you're going to have two factions against each other, that doesn't tell you necessarily who's going to win. It's more the choices within it, because the internal balance isn't perfect, and the scenario you choose is also going to maybe tip the favors towards one faction or another, or one play style or another. Maybe certain scenarios will be better for shooting armies, others will be better for close combat armies, others will be better for objective holders, others will be better for stealthy armies, whatever it happens to be. That is where you can kind of throw in that imbalance and make the game interesting. So not so much faction versus faction, but within a faction and within the scenario itself. That's where I'd actually put most of the imbalance, if you are going to control it, because obviously it can be hard to fully control it, because there's a lot of play testing, especially as you get more and more factions and more units within those factions. The number of permutations of things that you have to test gets quite large and almost impossible to manage. So I guess that's the question. Does balance really matter? Do you think so? Obviously the answer is yes, but where do you fall on that sliding scale? Do you like a game to be more balanced, perfectly balanced, less balanced, horribly imbalanced? I'd love to know. Leave a comment below. Happy wargaming.